Get great deals throughout the store at Safeway. This week at Safeway, get mega packs of bone-in USDA choice beef New York strip steaks for $5.97 per pound with digital coupon. Limit 2 packages. Plus, Haas avocados are 10 for $10. Member price. Also, this week at Safeway, mix or match 12 packs of 12-ounce cans or 8 packs of 12-ounce bottles of Coca-Cola, Pepsi, 7-Up, or Dr. Pepper are buy 2, get 3 free. Limit 3 free items. Member price plus CRV. Visit Safeway.com or head in store for more deals.
Wake up at Holiday Inn Express to a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. Count on all the hot, fresh coffee you need and an incredible breakfast buffet that has something for everyone, like eggs, cinnamon rolls, and even hot, fresh pancakes with all the toppings you crave. Next time, do yourself a favor and stay at a Holiday Inn Express with a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. So, when you wake up at Holiday Inn Express, you'll wake up happy. A part of IHG Hotels and Resorts.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's adventure. And today we'll be doing something a little different than what I typically do. I typically do a Bible teaching program. But after a lot of conversations the last couple of weeks, I found out that an awful lot of people don't understand how Hamas grew, how Hamas got so strong in Gaza, and how we got there. And then I also did pretty much this same content the day after the October 7th massacre in Israel. And I went back and listened to it immediately after, watched it. And candidly, I was way too angry about what had just happened. And I just didn't like the tone of what I did. So I've taken a deep breath and watched things unfold there. And in conversations, a lot of people decided kind of what is the value point. What can I offer in terms of perspective that might be valuable to people? So here is, we're going to talk today about how did we get here? How did Hamas get to be, to grow so much and to get so strong that it requires this kind of strong response from Israel in order to preserve their security and their nation, candidly. So little housekeeping stuff. This is listener/viewer supported broadcasting. And so if you want to help, please visit thefootlight.com. You can also find the show notes for today. Everything that I'm going to share with you is there at the footlight.com website. So let's start with a quick view of the map and what is the situation there, and how did Hamas get to be as strong as they are is really kind of the theme for what we're going to go through today. And so the first thing is, here is the map. Now this is a map drawn by Palestinians, but it still is the same. It's an accurate map. And so I'll share it with you here. So what you can see is 1917, all of this was controlled by, it's called Palestine, but it was all controlled by, at that point, by the British. Pretty much an entirely Arab population, although there had always been Jewish people living there. And throughout time, Jewish people continued to move in there and began to occupy the land. And there was ultimately a large Zionist movement, supported a lot by dispensationalists in the United States. And as that movement went on, people continued to, Jewish people continued to move into the land. And then, of course, there was World War II. And immediately after World War II, we saw this huge growth of the Jewish population in Israel, and supported by the Balfour Declaration and then the UN redrawing of the lines. And so in 1947, Israel became a nation, taking over all of the land that you see here indicated in the white on the map. And then in 1967, there was another war, and Israel occupied the small green area up in the top. And the area that's green on the right is called the West Bank, and the West Bank population got smaller. And then throughout time, Israelis continue to buy up land in the West Bank and move into the West Bank, and this is what were called settlers or the settlements, because what was happening is as the Jewish population was growing, they were buying land in the West Bank, and so the Palestinian population in the West Bank, the Arab population, and the amount of land they controlled continue to shrink over time, and this is part of what has caused this angst against Israel. Now, the Israelis disengaged from Gaza, and that's really what we're going to talk about today is how did Hamas grow? How did they get to be to the size that they are in Gaza? And so the Israeli disengagement from Gaza was a unilateral dismantling of the 21 Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. So just like in the West Bank, where Israelis were buying land and occupying it, they were buying land in Gaza and moving in and building, communities, kibbutzes, building synagogues, building their community there. And the Arabs were increasingly, the Palestinian people, if you will, although there was never been a historic people called Palestinian. This is a word that the English created out of the word Philistine. Regardless, the displaced Arabs were continuing to be more and more angry as the Israelis grew and purchased land in Gaza and in the West Bank. And so this is what led to a lot of the hostility back through the 70s, the 80s with the rise of the PLO and Yasser Arafat. And so we're not going to get into all of that history, but that is part of what this Palestinian liberation movement was about, is the Israeli settlements continuing to expand into what they considered to be Arab territory. Now, in 2005, there was a plan to dismantle the 21 Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip and to evacuate Israeli settlers and the Israeli army, which also was there protecting the Israeli citizens from inside the Gaza Strip. Okay, now this was proposed in 2003 by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who you'll see on the screen here for those watching on the video. I know if you're on the audio podcast, which is most of you, that won't help, but proposed in 2003 by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And it was adopted then by the government in 2004 and approved by the Knesset in 2005, in February 2005. They called it the Disengagement Plan Implementation Law. And in August 2005, they implemented this law, and they completed this disengagement in September 2005. So we're going to go through how this happened, how did the policy develop, and what has happened, how did it get implemented, and what happened since, okay? Now, there were settlers in the land there who'd purchased land, right? You gone in, you bought a house, you bought a piece of dirt, you and your friends and neighbors bought some piece of dirt, and you've got this little community. And there were settlers who said, hey, I'm not moving out of here. I bought a house here, right? And so those who refused to accept this idea were offered money. They gave them compensation packages to voluntarily vacate their homes prior to the August 15th, 2005 deadline. They gave them $500,000, I believe, each. And then anybody who wouldn't were evicted, okay? And the eviction of all the residents, the demolition of the residential buildings, and the evacuation of the associated security personnel from Gaza was completed on September 12th of 2005. The eviction and dismantling of the 4 settlements in the West Bank, because this happened in the West Bank also, was completed 10 days later. There were 8,000 Jewish settlers from 21 settlements in the Gaza Strip that were relocated. The settlers received it was more than $200,000 US in compensation per family, which is more like $1 million today, right? Maybe not, maybe 500,000. A lot of money. Following the withdrawal, Israel still continues to maintain direct control over Gaza's air and maritime space. 6 of Gaza's 7 land crossings. They maintain a no-go buffer zone within the territory, and they control the Palestinian population registry. And Gaza remains dependent on Israel for its water, electricity, telecommunications, and other utilities. That's why Israel can shut off now the electricity and the water and so on to Gaza. okay? Because they control it. They have maintained control over it. Now, not necessarily because they had to. The Palestinians have had opportunity to change that, and they have not taken advantage of it. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's son, Gilad, wrote that he gave his father the idea of disengagement. Sharon had originally dubbed the unilateral disengagement plan the separation plan before realizing that separation sounded pretty bad, especially in English, because it evoked apartheid, and some people have called this an apartheid style movement. But the idea here was that, look, we're never going to get along with these guys. They're always going to fight us. There's this cry for a two-state solution, so let's give them their land. Let's give them this area that they can control. Now, in November 2003, Ehud Olmert, who is Sharon's deputy leader, this is the guy here you see on the screen if you're watching the video, he'd been dropping unilateralist hints for 2 or 3 months. And he explained his developing policy. Of course, he went on to be prime minister. And here's what he said. There's no doubt in my mind that very soon the government of Israel is going to have to address the demographic issue with utmost seriousness and resolve. This issue, above all others, will dictate the solution that we must adopt. In the absence of a negotiated agreement, and I do not believe in the realistic prospect of an agreement, we need to implement a unilateral alternative. Again, this is Ehud Olmert I'm quoting here. More and more Palestinians are uninterested in a negotiated two-state solution because they want to change the essence of the conflict from an Algerian paradigm to a South African one. So they're trying to make it apartheid, right? From a struggle against occupation, in their parlance, to a struggle for one man, one vote. That is, of course, a much cleaner struggle, a much more popular struggle, and ultimately a much more powerful one. So he's agreeing that, look, this one man, one vote argument that they have, that's a strong argument. Okay, let him continue here. For us, it would mean the end of the Jewish state. The parameters of a unilateral solution are to maximize the number of Jews, to minimize the number of Palestinians, not to withdraw to the 1967 border, and not to divide Jerusalem. 23 years ago, Moshe Dayan proposed a unilateral autonomy. On the same length, we may have to espouse unilateral separation. It would inevitably preclude a dialogue with the Palestinians for at least 25 years. Now, the policy of separating out Gaza was to stop the idea of negotiation. Gaza and the West Bank, and isolate Arabs outside of Israel, because otherwise they would end up taking over Israel. Arabs have a lot more kids. Muslim policy allows multiple wives. It means that a single man may often have 10 or more children, and Israel's families were monogamous and had far fewer children. We're going to talk about this a little more here in a minute. Sharon's formally announced the policy in April 14th, 2004 letter to President George W. Bush, stating that there exists no Palestinian partner with whom to advance peacefully toward a settlement. In other words, we've been negotiating with these guys and we can't get anywhere. They are not a partner. No matter what we propose, they reject it. No matter what agreement they make, they break it. Since they're not a partner, we're going to stop. And here's what Dov Weisglass says, he was kind of a big advisor to both Sharon and Ehud Barak and other leaders there. And this is Dov Weisglass, okay, or Weisglass. I'm not sure how I'm pronouncing that right. It's 2 S's. Dov Weisglass said this. The man on the screen here. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. This whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with authority and permission. That is exactly what happened. All this with authority and permission. All this was with a presidential blessing. That's the United States president, right? And the ratification of both houses of Congress. That is exactly what happened. You know, the term peace process is a bundle of concepts and commitments. The peace process is the establishment of a Palestinian state with all the security risks that entails. The peace process is the evacuation of settlements. It's the return of refugees. It's the partition of Jerusalem. And all that has now been frozen. What I effectively agreed to with the Americans was that part of the settlements would not be dealt with at all, and the rest will not be dealt with until the Palestinians turn into Finnish people, right? Nice people that were our real partners. That is the significance of what we did. So this is Dove Weisglass saying, look, the whole purpose here is to stop the negotiations. We've been fighting back and forth with these people. We've been trying to make agreements. We've talked about their borders. We've talked about giving them a state. We've talked about partitioning Jerusalem, and nothing has worked. We don't have a partner in the process. So we are just going to freeze this whole process and stop going forward with it. Now, demographic concerns were a big part of this. The maintenance, we talked a minute ago about the Muslims and the Arabs having more children. The maintenance of a Jewish majority in the Israeli-controlled areas played a significant role in the development of the policy. The rationale for disengagement has partly been attributed to Aaron Soffer's campaign regarding the danger of that the Palestinian womb posed to Israeli democracy. Sharon mentioned the demographic rationale in a public address on August 15, 2005, the day of disengagement, as follows. Here's what he said, quote, this is Ariel Sharon, "It's no secret that, like many others, I had believed and hoped that we could forever hold on to Netzarim and Kfar Daram. These are settlements, communities in Gaza. But the changing reality in the country, in the region, and the world required of me a reassessment and change of positions. We cannot hold on to Gaza forever. More than 1 million Palestinians live there and double their number with each generation." So what Sharon is saying is, look, these guys are growing so fast. They're having so many kids. We'll never be able to hang on to this if there's a one man, one vote thing throughout Israel. And this echoes, if you remember, when the Israelis, when the Jewish people, the family of Jacob were captive in Egypt. If you remember what Pharaoh said, lest the Hebrews become too numerous, we must make their lives bitter. Pharaoh recognized that if the Hebrews prospered, that eventually they would outnumber the Egyptians. And it was the same thing. The Jewish people, because of God's blessing, valued children. If you remember, Jacob had 12 kids, right? So this is a lot of kids, right? And so this was a thing in Jewish culture, was to have a lot of kids. And it wasn't a thing in Egyptian culture. And so Pharaoh said, look, we need to make their lives bitter so that they can't support so many kids, because otherwise they're going to outgrow us. This is the very same thing that the Israelis were saying now about the Arabs, about the population of Palestinians, that look, these guys are growing. And if we're going to try and engage with them based on numbers, we're going to lose. Now, at the same time, Shimon Peres, who was then the vice president, vice prime minister, stated in an interview, and here's Shimon Peres, for those of you watching on the video, stated in an interview that we are disengaging from Gaza because of demography. It was demographics. And in other words, continued control of Gaza was considered to pose an impossible dilemma with respect to Israel's ability to be a Jewish and democratic state in all the territories it controlled. So they said, we're going to give up control of this area and let them have it. And we're going to maintain a Jewish state next to it, and they can have it all to themselves. Now, for the first time since 1967, Palestinian authorities would have complete control over exits and entrances to their territory. Now, Israel controlled who could come in to Israel, but the Palestinians controlled who could come into Gaza and into the West Bank. Both parties to the agreement, Israel and Palestinians, would upgrade and expand crossings to facilitate the movement of people and goods between Israel, Gaza, and West Bank. So in other words, they were developing almost like a free trade policy like the U.S. has with Canada, or with what's happening in the European Union. Separate borders, separate countries, but the movement of goods and stuff could go across. Palestinians would be allowed the use of bus and truck convoys to move between Gaza and the West Bank. Okay, so going back to our map here at the beginning, if you take a look, Gaza and the West Bank, you can see Gaza is the part on the left, and we've probably all seen these maps now. The West Bank is the part on the right. And so they were given the opportunity to move truck and bus convoys between them. Obstacles to movement in the West Bank would be lifted. A Palestinian seaport was to be constructed on the Gaza littoral. And then a Palestinian airport was considered important by both sides. And the United States was encouraging Israel to entertain the idea that construction to that end was to be resumed. Now, because the Palestinian Authority in Gaza did not believe it had sufficient control of the area at this time, observers such as Human Rights Watch and legal experts argued that disengagement didn't end Israel's legal responsibility as an occupying power. Israel and Egypt concluded an agreement under which Egypt can increase the number of police on its side of the border, and the IDF evacuated the Gazan side. Okay, now, what they were saying is, because all of the water supply in Gaza came from Israel, because all of the electricity in Gaza came from Israel, because you couldn't fly in and out of Gaza, because you couldn't get sea traffic in and out of Gaza because there was no port, that they were dependent on Israel for those things, and they considered that to be a de facto, occupation of Gaza. Now, how did they implement this plan? Well, first of all, the crossings were closed. The crossings in and out were closed. They didn't remain closed, but they were closed initially. The settlers in Gaza were moved out of Gaza. Okay, there were 8,000 people in Gaza, 14,000 soldiers, 8,000, not 8,000 people, 8,000 Israelis. Okay, 14,000 Israeli soldiers and police officers came in and forcibly evicted the settlers. They went house to house. Now, remember, many were volunteered and they were compensated, but anyone who didn't, the police, Israeli police and Israeli soldiers went house to house, ordering settlers to leave, breaking down the doors of those who didn't. There were scenes of IDF Israeli troops dragging screaming and sobbing families from their houses and from synagogues. Okay, some settlers, some of the Jewish people in Gaza, lit their homes on fire as they evacuated so that the Palestinians would be left nothing of value. Okay, residents and their supporters strung up barbed wire fences around the area. Okay, and Israeli security forces cut their way in. They were barricading themselves in their homes, saying, "Look, this is my home. I bought this. I built this. This is where my family lives. You can't take me out of here." They were arguing for their freedom to live there, but the agreement didn't allow that. Young people placed obstacles made of flammable materials like tires, barricades of tires, garbage dumpsters. They set them on fire. The fire spread into the Palestinian areas, and the IDF sent in bulldozers, the same kind of bulldozers they're using now in Gaza, military bulldozers. They sent them in to put out the fires, to bulldoze the fires down. Now, on August 19th, and this is 2005 now, so this is 18 years ago, The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, reported that some settlers had their children leave their homes with their hands up, wearing a Star of David badge to associate the actions of Israel at that time with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Some protesters said that they would not go like sheep to the slaughter, a phrase that was associated with the Holocaust. So this is what was, the IDF was moving these Jewish settlers out of Gaza and out of the West Bank. The evacuation of the settlers was completed August 22nd, 2005, and then demolition crews came in and razed 2,800 houses, community buildings, and 26 synagogues. They tore them down. The IDF also pulled its forces because the IDF maintained some military stations, bases, if you will, not big bases, but military operations facilities in Gaza. They pulled out their forces from Gaza, and they withdrew 95% of the military equipment by September 1st. On September 11th, again 2005, a ceremony was held when the last Israeli flag was lowered in the IDF's Gaza Strip divisional headquarters, and all remaining IDF forces left Gaza Strip in the following hours. Okay, so September 11th, 2000, ironically, September 11th, right? 2005. Now, on September 12th, Palestinian crowds entered the settlements waving PLO and Hamas flags, firing gunshots into the air, setting off firecrackers, chanting slogans. Radicals among them desecrated 4 remaining synagogues. Destroyed homes were ransacked. Hamas leaders held celebratory prayers in the Kfar Daram synagogue as mobs continued to ransack and loot the remaining synagogues. The Palestinian Authority security forces did not get in the way of these crowds destroying these facilities and announced that the synagogues would be destroyed. Less than 24 hours after the withdrawal, Palestinian Authority bulldozers began to demolish the remaining synagogues, and Hamas took credit for the withdrawal. And one of their banners read, 4 years of resistance. This is one of the intifadas. Beat 10 years of negotiations. So in other words, the lesson that Hamas learned, the lesson that the Palestinians learned is if we fight the Israelis enough, they will back up. That was the lesson they took. Now, after the Israel withdrew, Palestinians gained control over Gaza, except their borders. The Israelis controlled what went in and out, and the airspace and the territorial waters. Now, on September 23rd, which is just 10 days later, the Gazans shot rockets into Israel. A Hamas pickup truck drove through the Jabalia refugee camp. And this was a camp where the Israelis who had been moved out of Gaza were living. A Hamas pickup truck drove through the refugee camp, exploding itself, killing at least 19 people and injuring 85. And some of those people who died were the suicide bombers driving the truck. On September 29th, 2005, Israel closed all the Hamas charities in the West Bank as part of a 5-day offensive and fired artillery targets at Gaza. Now, Gaza is now this independent space, right? And it's totally Palestinians there. All of the Israelis are out, whether they liked it or not. All of the Israeli military and police are out, and it's left totally to themselves. And what we see there is the same thing that happens anytime a government withdraws or falls. We saw it in the old Soviet Union. We saw it in many of the Soviet republics. We see it all the time when governments collapse. You have a power struggle. Who's going to be in charge of this area? And so Fatah and Hamas began fighting with each other. And in the middle of this, there was an election going on. Okay, and the fighting with each other partly became who can damage the Israelis more by attacking Israel. And so Israel launched a thing called Operation Summer Rains, which was basically a bombing campaign to put down military facilities of both Fatah and Hamas. In January 2007, Hamas and Fatah weren't getting anywhere in their fighting. There was no clear winner. And both factions were attacking each other all over. And Israel launched an airstrike which destroyed a building used by Hamas. And this created a lot of sympathy for them. Okay. And the conflict reached a height, and Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007. Now, many people saw the Palestinian National Authority as economically uninteresting. Most of Europe, everybody's like, so what? They got 1.4 million people here, but there's no economy. But they were seen as a threat to the Jewish identity of the Israeli Democratic State. Leila Shahid, Speaker of the Palestinian National Authority in Europe, declared the sole fact of carrying out the plan unilaterally also showed the plan was only thought of according to the objectives of Israel as viewed by Sharon. Well, she wasn't wrong. She said, look, this is all about what Israel wants. And she's exactly right. Israel was doing what they thought was best for them. What they thought that the thing that they needed to do is to have control of their area and not try and battle with these guys for that area because it wasn't working. They had no partner. Okay, now enter President George W. Bush. George W. Bush endorsed the plan as a positive step toward the roadmap for peace. At a joint press conference with Ariel Sharon on April 11, 2005, here's what George Bush said. I strongly support Prime Minister Sharon's courageous initiative to disengage from Gaza and part of the West Bank. The Prime Minister is willing to coordinate the implementation of the disengagement plan with the Palestinians. I urge the Palestinian leadership to accept his offer. By working together, Israelis and Palestinians can lay the groundwork for a peaceful transition. So this is before it happened. Bush is saying, yeah, good idea. Go ahead, disengage. Now, May 26th of that year, George Bush held a joint press conference welcoming Mahmoud Abbas to the White House. Here is Mahmoud Abbas. This is what he looks like. He was the Palestinian leader. And George Bush, here's what he said at that meeting. He said, the imminent Israeli disengagement from Gaza, parts of the West Bank, presents an opportunity to lay the groundwork for a return to the roadmap. This is the famous roadmap to peace. And to help ensure that Gaza disengagement is a success, the United States, that's us, your money, will provide to the Palestinian Authority $50 million in 2005 dollars, right? So like $100 million today or more, to be used for new housing and infrastructure projects in the Gaza. Okay, now, part of this money that was coming into Gaza from the U.S. and then from other countries was to build the infrastructure, the very same infrastructure that Gaza now doesn't have. On April 11th, 2005, President George W. Bush said this: as part of the final peace settlement, Israel must have secure and recognized borders, which should emerge from negotiations between the parties in accordance with UN Resolution 242 and 338. In the light of new realities on the ground, including already existing major Israeli population centers, it's unrealistic that the outcome of the final status of negotiations will be a full and complete return to the armistice lines of 1949, which is what the Palestinians were asking for. Now, in his May 26th joint press conference with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas in the White House Rose Garden, and here's a picture of these characters in the White House Rose Garden. Good buddies, right? Both nice smiles, big handshake, right? Here's what President George W. Bush said at that meeting. Here's what he had to say. Any final status agreement must be reached between the two parties, and changes to the 1949 armistice lines must be mutually agreed to. A viable two-state solution must ensure contiguity of the West Bank. In other words, it has to be all together, and a state of scattered territories will not work. There must also be meaningful linkages between the West Bank and Gaza. This is the position of the United States today. It will be the position of the United States at the time of the final status of negotiations. So the U.S. was a big player in bringing about this state of, separateness of Gaza, the disengagement of Israel from Gaza and the West Bank. This was largely fueled by the United States. Javier Solana, another guy here we should take a look at. This is Javier Solana. He was the High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. Here's what he had to say. I welcome the Israeli Prime Minister's proposals for the disengagement from Gaza. This represents an opportunity to restart the implementation of the roadmap as endorsed by the UN Security Council. The Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, however, Brian Cowen, he was the president of the EU at the time, announced the European Union's disapproval of the plan's limited scope. Here's what he said. It doesn't go far enough. It's only addressing withdrawal from some of the West Bank, not all of the West Bank. He said that the EU will not recognize any change to the pre-1967 borders other than those agreed to by the parties. In other words, Israel's doing this unilaterally. There's not agreement from the Palestinians, so we're not going to support it. It doesn't go far enough because the Palestinians are not in agreement. Now, Kofi Annan, another player on the stage here, he was the General Secretary of the United Nations at that point. Here is what Kofi Annan, Rush Limbaugh used to call him Goofy Annan. Here's what he said on August 18th of 2005, what he called Prime Minister Sharon's courageous decision to carry through with the painful process of disengagement. He expressed the hope that both Palestinians and Israelis will exercise restraint in this challenging period and believes that a successful disengagement should be the first step toward a resumption of the peace process in accordance with the roadmap. Ibrahim Gambari, Undersecretary for Political Affairs of the UN, told the Security Council on August 24, 2005, again 18 years ago, Israel has demonstrated that it has the requisite maturity to do what would be required to achieve lasting peace. And the Israeli Defense Forces has demonstrated their ability to discharge their mission with carefully calibrated restraint. Prime Minister Sharon should be commended for his determination and courage to carry out the disengagement in the face of forceful and strident internal opposition. So there were a lot of Israelis who didn't support this idea, but Kofi Annan was full steam ahead on it. Now, who is Hamas? Who are these people, and how do we get them to be? How did they get to be so strong? How did they get to grow? So, Hamas means Islamic Resistant Movement. It's a Palestinian Sunni Islamic fundamentalist militant and nationalist organization. Okay, they won election in 2006. That's how Hamas got control. In 2006, there was an election, and they won it. Canada, the European Union, Israel, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. New Zealand and Paraguay have designated only its military wing as a terrorist organization. It's not considered a terrorist organization by Brazil, by China, by Egypt, by Iran, of course, especially, who are funding it, by Norway, by Qatar, by Russia, Syria, or Turkey. None of these countries consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. In December 2018, just 5 years ago, a resolution to condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization failed to pass the UN General Assembly. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh is based in Qatar. So the organization is run out of Qatar, not out of Gaza or the West Bank. Hamas was founded in 1987, soon after the First Intifada broke out. It was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which basically had a Gaza branch, and previously the Muslim Brotherhood had been non-confrontational to Israel. They were hostile to the PLO. Co-founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin said in 1987, and the Hamas charter affirmed in 1988, that Hamas was founded to liberate Palestine, including modern-day Israel, from Israeli occupation and to establish an Islamic State in the area that is now Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Since 1994, the group has frequently stated to accept a truce if Israel withdraws to the 1967 borders, paid reparations, allowed free elections in the territories, and gave Palestinian refugees a right to return. Now, they've had varying conflicts of varying intensity over the years, right? And Hamas's military wing has launched attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers. They often describe them as retaliations, in particular for assassinations of the upper echelon of Hamas leadership. Of course, tactics have included suicide bombings and, since 2001, rocket attacks. Hamas's Human Rights Watch has condemned as war crimes and crimes against humanity Hamas and Israel's attacks on civilians during the conflict, stating the rationale of reprisals is never valid when civilians are targeted. In January 2006, PLO had parliamentary elections, and Hamas won a majority in the parliament. They defeated Fatah. After the elections, the Quartet, the European Union, Russia, the United Nations, the United States made future foreign assistance to the Palestinian National Authority contingent on the PNA's commitment to nonviolence, recognition of the State of Israel, and acceptance of previous agreements. Hamas said, no, we're not going to agree to that. And so then the aid was suspended. Now, all of these rockets are something that we need to talk about briefly. Where does Hamas get rockets? Well, the West, that's us and the European Union and other groups, it's often talked about that Gaza doesn't have an effective water supply of its own. They get their water from Israel. They have desalination plants, but they can't distribute the water because they don't have a plumbing system of their own and a pumping system. So the West has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on pipes to, to send in to help them to build their water infrastructure. And Hamas takes the pipes that are meant to improve the life of the Palestinian people and uses them to build rockets of various sizes. And that's why they're crude rockets. That's why they often go off target and hit the parking lot of a hospital instead of the target in Israel. Now, the Hamas Charter was published in August of 1988. It defined itself as a chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood and reflected its desire to establish an Islamic state throughout Palestine. Now, what they mean by Palestine is the Palestine of 1917. Let me get that back up on the screen here so you can take a look and see what that looks like. Again, the Palestine of 1917 is what these guys are talking about, which is the whole green area here. As the saying goes, they say from the river to the sea. And so this Palestinian state that they want means the entire non-existence of Israel. The Hamas Charter contains anti-Semitic passages. It declares all of Palestine a waqf, WAQF, an unalienable religious property that consists of land endowed to Muslims in perpetuity by God. In other words, God gave us this land. There can be nobody else in control of this land. There can be religious coexistence as long as Islam is in control. And the Charter of Hamas rejects a two-state solution, stating that the conflict cannot be resolved except through jihad. Article 6 of the Hamas Charter states that the movement's aim is to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, for under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety where their lives, possessions, and rights are concerned. It adds that when our enemies usurp some Islamic lands, jihad becomes a duty binding on all Muslims for which the whole of the land is a non-negotiable. In other words, Hamas says unless all of Israel is, Israeli control is driven out, unless we control the land, in which case anyone can live here under our control, unless we control the land, the only way to get there is war. For Hamas to concede territory is seen as equivalent to renouncing Islam itself. The violent language against all Jews in the original Hamas Charter is anti-Semitic and has been characterized by some as genocidal. Now, in May 2017, 6 years ago, Hamas unveiled its new charter in an attempt to moderate its image. The charter no longer calls for Israel's destruction, but calls for the liberation of Palestine and to confront the Zionist project. Now, where do they get their money? Okay, Hamas leaders' statements indicated that they read George W. Bush's outline of a new world order as embodying a tacit aim to destroy Islam. So they thought that this new world order that Bush talked about after our 9/11 in 2001 was that that the goal was to destroy Islam. And therefore, funding should focus on enhancing the Islamic roots of Palestinian society and promoting jihad. About half of Hamas's funding come from states in the Persian Gulf. Down to the mid-2000s, Saudi Arabia supplied half of the Hamas budget. Okay, but under U.S. pressure, the Saudis began cutting its funding and cracking down on Islamic charities that provided donor transfers to Hamas. By 2006, this had been drastically reduced, and so Iran and Qatar stepped in to fill the gap. Now, the military wing of Hamas. I'm not going to be able to necessarily pronounce this right. The Izzad Din al-Qassam Brigades is Hamas's military wing. Now, the number of the members of this military wing is only known to their leadership. Israel estimates the brigades have a core of several hundred members who get military-style training. That would be in concert with what we just found out. About 500 went to Iran and Syria for training by the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, and but they estimate that the brigades have an estimated 10 to 17,000 operatives that form a backup force. Okay, and whenever circumstances call for reinforcements, they call in these 10 to 17,000 people. Recruitment training lasts 2 years. In other words, they have like a 2-year boot camp program. The group's ideology outlines its aim as the liberation of Palestine and the restoration of Palestinian rights under the dispensation set forth in the Quran. And it translates into 3 policy priorities for the military wing. To evoke the spirit of jihad among Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, to defend Palestinians and their land against the Zionist occupation and its manifestations, and to liberate Palestinians and their land that was usurped by the Zionist occupation forces and settlers. Those are the stated goals of the military wing of Hamas. Now, according to official stipulations, the Izzad Din al-Qassam Brigade's military operations are to be restricted to operating only inside Palestine. Engaging with Israeli soldiers and exercising the right of self-defense against armed settlers. They are to avoid civilian targets, to respect the enemy's humanity by refraining from mutilation, defacement, or excessive killing, and to avoid targeting Westerners either in occupied zones or beyond. That's its official rules. Obviously, they don't follow their own rules. They use human shields and operate military installations in hospitals and schools. They use children as combatants, and they employ suicide bombings and attack civilians. Okay, so this is what they do. They may claim to attack combatants only, but no. Now, how does Hamas develop people who believe this stuff? Well, one thing is they have Al-Aqsa TV. This is a television channel founded by Hamas. The station began broadcasting in Gaza on January 9, 2006. Less than 3 weeks before the Palestinian elections, and it shows television programs, including some children's TV, which deliver anti-Semitic messages. And take a look here. This is a picture of some kids watching their knockoff of Mickey Mouse called Farfour. Now, Farfour is an anti-Semitic character who is constantly all day long on every program talking about the evilness of the Jews. In fact, in one program, Farfour claimed that the Jews make matzah bread from the bodies of dead Palestinians. And so they are indoctrinating kids from, what are these kids in the picture? Little, maybe 3, 5, 7 years old, depending on it, but there's definitely some very young kids here. And so this starts when these kids are very little, and they are indoctrinating them. And remember, this has been going on almost 20 years. You have a whole generation of indoctrinated people in Gaza. Okay. Now, Hamas says that this is an independent media institution that doesn't express the Palestinian government's view, right? But the reality is Hamas controls it. They also say Hamas is not anti-Semitic, which it obviously is. The programming does contain all these children's shows. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, says that the station promotes terrorist activity and incites hatred of Jews and Israelis. Now, the elections in 2006, were they valid? The EU figured prominently in this proposal that democratic elections be held in the territories. In the run-up to polling day, Condoleezza Rice, who was the U.S.'s Secretary of State at the time, and Israel's Tzipi Livni, their Secretary of State, and British Prime Minister Tony Blair, all expressed reservations about allowing Hamas to compete in a democratic process because they were afraid they'd win, and they knew what they would do when they'd win. So Hamas ran on a platform of clean government. They had a thorough overhaul of the corrupt administrative system and the issue of rampant lawlessness. The Palestinian Authority was riddled with graft and corruption, which is no surprise. The evacuation of Israel gave currency to Hamas's view that resistance had compelled Israel to leave Gaza. So the resistance movement was fueled by Israel's disengagement plan. Mohammed Deif, who's an authority in the Hamas, attributed the liberation of Gaza to his comrades' love of martyrdom. Hamas won 76 seats, excluding 4 won by independents and Hamas, and Fatah won only 43 in that election, giving Hamas control. This election in Gaza was judged by the international observers to have been competitive and genuinely democratic. The EU said they had been better run than elections in some member countries of the Union and promised to maintain its financial support for the Palestinian National Authority, now run by Hamas. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates urged the U.S. to give Hamas a chance and that it was inadvisable to punish Palestinians for their choice. In other words, keep the money flowing because, after all, you wanted democratic elections and they had them. 3 months later, the EU froze financial assistance to the Hamas-led government following the examples set by the U.S. and Canada. It undertook instead, the EU did, to channel funds directly to people and projects and pay salaries only to Fatah members, employed or otherwise. So that is how we get to Hamas's growth. That's the story of it. And so since that time, Hamas has continued to receive funding from abroad, from Arab states primarily, Iran more than any other, and not only the Palestinian National Authority, but Hamas as the governing body, and almost all of the aid that comes in has gone not to humanitarian projects, not to building power supply plants, not to building water infrastructure, not to building that airport that they should have. The money coming in has almost entirely gone into the Hamas military wing and into the growth of their arsenal. So today, where that winds us up is with Hamas much stronger than they ever should have been through a process that was intended to isolate them by Israel and the West. And where it leaves us today is with Israel fighting what is effectively a second war for independence. And may God bless them, and may they succeed in their endeavor of driving this bloodthirsty terrorist organization out of the Gaza and literally wiping them off of the planet. So that is the synopsis. I know that's a lot of information, but a lot of people keep asking, how did Hamas get so large? I've been fielding this question from friends and coworkers who know that I kind of tend to study this stuff a lot. And so that's how Hamas got to be as big and strong as they are, and how they got to be in control of the Gaza and of the Palestinian National Authority. This has been the Footlight Broadcast. If you find value in this kind of broadcasting, please visit thefootlight.com to support the work, and you can find the show notes there, all of the quotes and references that we just discussed at thefootlight.com website. Thanks again. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will see you next time.
Every day, my company gets scam phishing emails trying to get money or sensitive info. I wanted to protect my employees and my clients, so I checked out CISA's Secure Our World. They've got simple ways we can protect our businesses from online threats. First, teach employees to recognize and report phishing. Next, require strong passwords plus multi-factor authentication. And finally, turn on automatic updates for your business software. To learn more, go to CISA at cisa.gov/Secure Our World.
At Grainger, we're for the ones who specialize in saving the day and for the ones who've mastered the art of keeping business moving. We offer industrial-grade supplies for every industry with same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders, all backed by real people ready to help. So you can get the right answers and products right when you need them. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.